Juan Cortina's Raid of Brownsville, Texas, 1859. The United States-Mexican War of 1848 was fought because of a territorial dispute which initially involved Tejas. In the end, the United States celebrated victory and essentially gains additional territory which makes up all of present-day Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. Ultimately, Mexico conceded all claims to Tejas and recognized the Rio Grande River as America's southern boundary as it stands today. After the end of the war is when things dramatically change, primarily for the worst. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, specifically Articles 8, 9, and 10, supposedly placed property rights as inviolably respected, and Mexicans, those who found themselves on this side of the border, were presented with a choice. Either remain Mexican, but by the end of the year, one would automatically gain U.S. citizenship. Really not much of a choice here. Instead, what actually transpired was gross violations against these rights that were simply ignored altogether very quickly. Nonetheless, throughout this transitional period, the era became characterized as one of violence and grave injustices against the Mexican population that resided on this side of the territory. This transitional period brought significant negative economic and political changes onto the landscape that were associated with manifest destiny, which is the premise of Anglo-political, racial, and ethnocentric superiority that provoke military confrontation. In this new social order, the Mexican community would see displacement, injustice, and to some extent, genocide. In these former Mexican states, Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, Wyoming, and last but not least, Texas, land disputes resulted in clashes between Mexicans and Americans and cultivated much animosity between the two cultures. In this new order, the United States government authorities, as well as the American newcomers, simply ignored any property rights, of which some dated back to 1767 as guaranteed by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Additionally, many Mexican Texans were never informed of such rights and were purposely kept in the dark. Moreover, in the Trans Nueces, the state of Texas was determined to settle the titles to the lands, and Article 8 of the Texas Constitution allowed for the confiscation of land if the owner had left the land vacant or refused to participate in the Texas Revolution or aided the Mexicans in the conflict. Unsurprisingly, there would be some resistance against these conditions, and we will see some organized groups and persons who would confront the American occupation of their soil. A person who became the most renowned and who successfully resisted this new social political structure, for a time at least, was Juan Nepomuceno Cortina. Juan Cortina was born on May 16, 1824 in Camargo, a border town that existed on the Mexican side of the border. He was 5 feet, 6 inches in height, green eyes, composed of a ruddy complexion, and had black hair and a beard. Even today, Camargo is a town which has one of the most richest soil in the world that produces vast amounts of cotton. In Camargo, Cortina's family owned livestock and over 1,000 acres of land. Juan's father, Trinidad, was an attorney who died during Cortina's early years as a young man. The death of his father left Cortina to be raised in a single-parent household by his mother, Estefana Cavazos, herself a strong woman who was prominent in business and politics. Early on, Cortina developed leadership skills born out of instinct rather than through formal education. Walter Prescott Webb would describe Cortina's qualities as having the disposition of a gambler, an eye for the main chance, and a keen intuitive insight into the character of the Mexicans made him a man of destiny. Cortina's own upbringing and life experiences would serve to nourish these qualities as his greatest strength. However, his charisma and love for the land resulted in his gaining fame and notoriety among his friends and enemies. Another historical source from which we draw a further description of Cortina is Benjamin F. McIntyre, a soldier in the Union Army. He wrote of Cortina in 1864. In appearance, he is of medium size, about 40 years of age. He is a genial companion, but a man of few words. He is a daring, intrepid soldier and inspires those under him with confidence. The Brownsville Herald described him as a man of few words, and the silence he maintained of any and all occasions led to the belief that he was a man of deep knowledge. There is no doubt that he possessed a large amount of common sense, and he was also a good judge of men. What we know of Cortina is that he was a complex individual, that he was self-driven and possessed an energetic mind. According to Jose Thomas Canales, a prominent attorney and scholar of Tejas, Texas history, who is now deceased, we glean a further description of Cortina. Canales wrote that Cortina had disciplined himself to become a model of a good soldier, which enabled him to weather the hardships of military life. It made him a hardened man and a heroic figure to his people. He could be methodical, persistent, and clear-headed under intense pressure. Cortina had a skill that could almost remove himself from reality as if he was staring at himself. Another historical source, Charles W. Goldfinch, a graduate student at the University of Chicago, completed the first scholarly work of Cortina and wrote that Cortina had not been involved in cattle stealing, but had been the victim of a smear campaign conducted by Texans with ulterior motives. We also know that Juan was a skilled vaquero. A Texas ranger told a reporter of the New York Times many years later that Cortina could handle the lariat better than anyone the Southwest ever produced. Additionally, the ranger recalled that Cortina was the nerviest and quickest man with a shooter I ever saw. His skill at roping was remarkable, and his horsemanship was superb. Speaking of vaqueros, one has to realize that the vaquero came way before the American cowboy, and from them they learned these same skills which served them well. As for people who had bitter enmity for Cortina, like the Texas Rangers, including various merchants in Texas and most Texas newspapers as well, they had other less praiseworthy things to say about him. Texas Ranger N.A. Jennings wrote in 1899 that about 3,000 robbers were under him, and he was virtually the ruler of the Mexican border. While the Corpus Christi Ranchero wrote that under Cortina, the area had been sacked for hundreds of miles, and its inhabitants were ruthlessly murdered. Another source, Frank Dobie, renowned Texas folklorist, refers to Cortina as the most striking, the most powerful, the most insolent, and the most daring, as well as the most elusive bandit that ever wet his horse in the muddy waters of the Rio Bravo. Dobie maintained that Cortina was responsible for a reign of terror on the border, a great bandito who plundered and murdered. This coming from a man who regarded the Texas Rangers as heroes, of which, according to oral Hispanic and non-Hispanic histories, as well as many eyewitness accounts, they were most certainly not. Another person that viewed Cortina with much animosity was John S. Rip Ford, also a Texas Ranger, who knew Cortina for the better part of his life and considered each other avowed enemies. Ford said that Cortina was a wild boy and the black sheep of the family and someone who was bad in school. Ford goes on to say that Cortina had attained manhood without being able to read or write. However, even despite of his illiteracy, Ford also said that Cortina possessed a great natural shrewdness, personal bravery, and a complete knowledge of the native Mexican. To the peons or indigenos, which is Spanish for indigenous, he was Cheno Cortina, a patron who came to their aid in times of trouble, who lent them money, and at times served as their padrino or godfather at baptisms. The making of a revolutionary. I never signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Juan Cortina. Briefly, I will encapsulate two important events which affected Juan Cortina in a way that simmered his anger and eventually projected it outward in a most violent manner. The fall of Mexico City to the U.S. forces in July of 1847 and the subsequent signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the war, had a dramatic impact on Mexicans living on this side of the river.
In September of 1847, only a quarter of a century after American colonists had first come to Texas, U.S. forces were in Mexico City as conquerors. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the war and redrew our Mexican boundary from the Rio Grande to California. We paid Mexico $15 million for most of what is now the Pacific Southwest.
Cortina came to accept that he now lived on the land that became a part of the United States, and an adjustment to the American-dominated legal system was going to be the norm. The issue of land ownership would be the catalyst that brought violence later. The first event that changed Cortina forever was a series of disputes over land titles that erupted between the heirs to the original land grants to the newly arrived Anglos and settlers of European-born ancestry. Although there is documented fact that there were interpersonal feuds between Cortina and several business acquaintances, it was the extended legal complications over land itself that set Cortina to the edge of open rebellion. That part of land I am referring to is the Espiritu Santo grant, which belonged to Cortina's mother, Estefana. Apparently, Cortina was very angry in the way Glavecki and County Judge Elisha Bass had divided the Espiritu Santo grant into 6 equal parts, with Estefana receiving the western portion as an inheritance. Later on, to stave off potential costly legal proceedings that could have cost them their entire tracts, she was forced to concede 4,428 acres to her lawyers, Hale and Allen, in defense of their title against the claims of Stillman and his partners. Her reasoning was that it was better to lose a part of the land grant than to become embroiled in a court battle where they could potentially lose all of their tracts. On January 1852, Judge J.C. Watrous declared the grant as valid, which meant that it placed the heirs to the grant in possession of the land on which Brownsville had been built. This decision ended up being so controversial that Watrous was impeached. The following month, the Texas legislature confirmed the grant that was sold to Stillman's lawyers, Elisha Bass and Robert H. Hord, for the value of $33,000, or 1/6 of its appraised value. Essentially, what happened was that Estefana, in a series of clever maneuvers, was tricked into signing away her rights to the Brownsville tract for the sum of $1, whereby the land was then transferred to Stillman and the Brownsville Town Company. Cortina deeply resented how this deal was finalized and felt that his mother had been cheated in the process. An observation seen by an illiterate seaman sheds some light about the legal atmosphere in the lower Rio Grande Valley to Governor Sam Houston. He describes it in this way. Dear Sir, no doubt you would like to know something about the Cortina affair. The original difficulty is nothing more than a land robbing affair which is carried on in a very extensive scale, and that done in Judge Watrous' court. The poor devil of a Mexican has no chance. He is told by the robber and lawyer he has no title to his land, and that another person once the very land was born and raised on, and his father before him, and now he is told he has no title. And the very considerate gentleman that tells a Mexican that his title is not worth anything makes him an offer of a small amount and advises him to take it, and if not, there will be no alternative but law, and that in Judge Watrous' court they know there is no justice for them. They will know the other only alternative is to get what the robber and lawyer think proper to give him. The same was observed by a number of individuals at the time, including John L. Haynes, the state representative from the Rio Grande Valley. who understood the reasons behind the Cortina War. He stated that a settled belief on the part of the citizens of Mexican origin that frauds were being attempted against them to deprive them of their lands.